I was 11 years old when this happened, living in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone else's business. My family had moved there when I was 8, so I was still considered one of the newer kids at school, even after 3 years. We lived in a modest 2-story house on Maple Street, just 4 blocks from the elementary school, which meant I could walk to and from school every day. My parents both worked full-time jobs, so this independence was necessary, but also something I genuinely enjoyed. The routine was simple enough. I'd walk to school in the morning, usually with my neighbor Katie, who was in the same grade, and then walk home in the afternoon, sometimes stopping at the corner store for candy or just taking the long way home if the weather was nice. Our town was the kind of place where parents felt comfortable letting their kids roam around unsupervised, at least during daylight hours. Crime was rare, and most adults looked out for all the children in the neighborhood, not just their own. This particular incident started in early October, right around the time when the days were getting shorter and the walk home from school was happening closer to dusk. I'd started noticing a man who seemed to be around the same areas where I walked every day. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Small towns don't have that many different routes between the school and residential areas, so seeing the same people regularly wasn't unusual. But something about this man bothered me. He was probably in his 40s, average height, with dark hair and a mustache. He dressed like most adults in our town, work clothes. Nothing particularly distinctive. What made me notice him was that he always seemed to be watching me specifically. Not just glancing around like people do when they're walking, but actually tracking my movements with his eyes. The first few times I noticed him, he was across the street from the school when classes let out. He'd be standing near a parked car, smoking a cigarette and looking toward the group of kids leaving the building. When I'd start walking home, I'd sometimes see him again a few blocks later, maybe coming out of a store or walking in the same direction. It could have been innocent, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. I mentioned it to Katie one afternoon when we were walking home together. "Have you noticed that man with the mustache who's always around when we're walking home?" I asked her. Katie looked around and shrugged. "There are lots of people around here," she said. "Which one do you mean?" When I tried to point him out, though, he wasn't visible anywhere. That's when I realized he might be deliberately staying out of sight when I was with other people. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to when and where I saw him. When I walked home alone, he'd appear at various points along my route. When I was with Katie or other friends, I never saw him at all. He seemed to know my schedule and was timing his appearances for when I was isolated. I wanted to tell my parents, but I wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid or silly. Adults were always telling kids not to talk to strangers, but they didn't usually take reports of stranger sightings very seriously unless something clearly threatening had happened. This man hadn't approached me or said anything. He was just there, watching, following at a distance. The situation escalated on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October. I'd stayed after school for about 20 minutes to help my teacher, Mrs. Patterson, organize some classroom supplies. When I finally left the building, most of the other kids were already gone, and the usual crowd around the school had dispersed. I started walking home alone, taking my usual route down Oak Street toward Maple. about 2 blocks from school. I noticed the man with the mustache again. This time, instead of being across the street or at a distance, he was walking on the same side of the street as me, maybe 50 yards behind. I slowed down to see if he would pass me, but he slowed down too. I sped up slightly, and so did he. There was no question now that he was deliberately following me. I was scared, but tried to think rationally about what to do. I considered going into one of the stores along Oak Street, but most of them were closed by that time of day. I thought about knocking on someone's door, but my parents had always taught me not to bother neighbors unless it was a real emergency. Was this an emergency? I wasn't sure. Instead, I decided to test whether the man was really following me by taking a different route home. Instead of continuing down Oak Street, I turned left onto Pine Street, which would eventually connect to Maple, but would take me about 10 minutes out of my way. I looked over my shoulder as I turned the corner, and sure enough, the man turned too. Now I was genuinely frightened. There was no innocent explanation for why someone would follow an 11-year-old girl down multiple streets, matching her pace and changing directions when she did. I started walking faster, and I could hear his footsteps speeding up behind me. Pine Street was less populated than Oak Street, with fewer houses and more empty lots, which made me feel more vulnerable. About halfway down Pine Street, I made a decision that probably saved me from whatever this man was planning. I saw Mrs. Henderson, one of my mother's friends, working in her front garden. Mrs. Henderson knew me well enough to help if I needed it, and her house was in a well-lit area with neighbors close by. I ran up to her fence and called out, "Mrs. Henderson, can I use your phone to call my mom?" She looked up, saw the panicked expression on my face, and immediately invited me into her house. As I walked up her front path, I looked back and saw the man with the mustache standing at the end of her driveway, watching. Mrs. Henderson noticed him too. "Do you know that man?" she asked me quietly as we went inside. When I explained that he'd been following me for several blocks, her expression became very serious. She called my mother at work and explained the situation, then called the police to report a suspicious person following a child. 2 police officers arrived within 15 minutes. By then, the man was gone, but they took my description and asked detailed questions about when and where I'd seen him before. They seemed to take the report seriously, which was both reassuring and terrifying. If the police thought this was worth investigating, then I'd been right to be scared. The officers drove me home and spoke with my parents about safety precautions. They suggested that I shouldn't walk alone anymore, at least for a while, and that I should vary my route home when possible. They also gave me their direct phone number and told me to call immediately if I saw the man again. For the next 2 weeks, my mother picked me up from school every day, and I wasn't allowed to walk around the neighborhood alone. I was frustrated by the restriction, but I was also relieved not to have to worry about being followed. Katie and I talked about the incident, and she admitted that she'd noticed the man a few times, but hadn't thought much of it. Then, about 3 weeks after the police report, I learned why the officers had taken my complaint so seriously. Another girl from my school, a 5th grader named Jennifer, who lived about 6 blocks away from me, had been approached by a man matching the same description. He'd tried to convince her to get into his car, claiming he was a friend of her parents and needed to drive her home. because of a family emergency. Jennifer was smart enough not to believe him and ran home immediately to tell her parents. When the police compared her description to mine, they realized we were dealing with the same individual. They increased patrols in our neighborhood and issued a warning to all parents about a suspicious man targeting elementary school children. The investigation revealed that this man had been observed near several schools in our town and in neighboring communities. He seemed to be systematically identifying children who walked home alone and following them to learn their routines. The police believed he was planning to abduct one of his targets, but hadn't yet found the right opportunity or victim. About a month later, they caught him. His name was Robert Caldwell, and he was a 43-year-old maintenance worker who had moved to our town just 6 months earlier. He'd been fired from his previous job in another state after being accused of inappropriate behavior around children, though charges hadn't been filed at the time. When police searched Caldwell's apartment, they found detailed notes about local children, including descriptions of their appearances, schedules, and walking routes. My name was on one of the lists, along with information about what time I left school and which streets I used to get home. He'd been stalking multiple children simultaneously, gathering intelligence for what appeared to be a planned abduction. Caldwell was charged with stalking, attempted kidnapping, and several other crimes related to his surveillance of children. During the investigation, police discovered that he'd been doing the same thing in previous towns where he'd lived, always targeting elementary school children, always following them to learn their patterns, always moving to a new location before his behavior attracted too much attention. He eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The prosecutor told my parents that my willingness to report the suspicious behavior and Mrs. Henderson's quick thinking in calling police had likely prevented Caldwell from successfully abducting a child. This experience taught me several important lessons about personal safety and trusting instincts. As an 11-year-old, I'd been worried about seeming paranoid or bothering adults with concerns that might turn out to be nothing. But my gut feeling that something was wrong had been completely accurate. The man following me really was a dangerous predator planning to hurt children. I also learned that predators often spend significant time studying their potential victims before acting. Caldwell hadn't just randomly grabbed the first child he saw. He'd been systematically observing multiple children for weeks or months, learning their routines and identifying the ones who seemed most vulnerable to attack. The incident changed how my family approached child safety. My parents became much more involved in knowing where I was and who I was with at all times. They taught me specific protocols for different types of dangerous situations and made sure I understood that it was always better to err on the side of caution when something felt wrong. Most importantly, they emphasized that adults should always take children's safety concerns seriously, even if they seem minor or based on vague feelings rather than concrete evidence. My initial observations about the man following me hadn't been dramatic or clearly threatening, but they'd been accurate indicators of genuine danger. I'm grateful that Mrs. Henderson was working in her garden that day and that she didn't hesitate to help when I asked. If I'd tried to continue walking home alone, If I'd convinced myself I was being silly, if I hadn't found an adult to help me, Caldwell might have found the opportunity he was looking for to grab me. The experience also taught me that predators often target children specifically because we're taught to be polite and not cause trouble. Caldwell was counting on kids like me to ignore their instincts rather than risk seeming rude or paranoid. Teaching children that it's okay to be rude, to run away, to make noise, and to bother adults when they feel unsafe is crucial for preventing these kinds of crimes. Even now, as an adult, I'm hypervigilant about people who seem to be paying too much attention to children in inappropriate ways. I've called police several times over the years to report suspicious individuals near schools or playgrounds, and I've never regretted making those reports, even when they turned out to be harmless misunderstandings. Children deserve to feel safe in their own neighborhoods, and adults have a responsibility to take their safety concerns seriously. Robert Caldwell targeted our small town specifically because he thought parents and kids would be less cautious there. He was wrong about that, but only because people like Mrs. Henderson and the police officers who responded to my report understood that child safety should always be the top priority. I was 9 years old and in 4th grade when I experienced something that still gives me nightmares 30 years later. We lived in a suburban development that had been built in the early 1980s. One of those neighborhoods where all the houses looked similar and were arranged around curved streets with names like Willowbrook Drive and Meadowview Lane. It was the kind of place where kids could ride bikes until dark and parents didn't worry much about where we were as long as we came home for dinner. Our house was on Willowbrook Drive, a dead-end street with about 12 homes arranged in a rough circle. At the end of the street, where it curved around and connected back to the main road, there was a small wooded area that we called the woods, though it was really just a few acres of trees and undergrowth that had been left undeveloped. The woods backed up to the yards of the houses on the outer edge of our circle, including ours. The neighborhood kids spent a lot of time playing in those woods. We'd built a few simple forts out of fallen branches and plywood scraps that our parents let us take from their garage workshops. There were paths worn smooth by years of children's feet, and most of us knew every tree, rock, and hiding spot in that small patch of forest. It was our private playground, and our parents considered it safe because it was completely surrounded by residential properties. My best friend at the time was a boy named David who lived 3 houses down from us. David was a year older than me and had 2 younger sisters, which meant he often looked for excuses to get out of his house and away from what he called girl stuff. We'd spend hours in the woods together, sometimes with other neighborhood kids, sometimes just the 2 of us, building forts, playing army, or just exploring. David had a fascination with military history and survival skills that was pretty advanced for a 10-year-old. He'd read books about World War II and the Vietnam War, and he was always trying to teach me techniques. He'd learned about camouflage, tracking, and hiding from enemies. Most of it was just kid stuff, games we played to make our time in the woods more exciting, but David took it very seriously. This particular incident happened on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. My parents were doing yard work, and David's parents had given him permission to play outside. as long as he stayed in the neighborhood. We'd decided to work on expanding one of our forts, which meant hauling some additional wood and supplies deeper into the woods than we usually went. The fort we were working on was about 10 minutes walk from the edge of the neighborhood, in a small clearing surrounded by thick undergrowth. It wasn't visible from any of the houses, which made it feel like our secret hideout. We'd been working for about an hour, arranging branches and trying to make the structure more weatherproof, when David suddenly stopped what he was doing and held up his hand for silence.
Did you hear that?
He whispered, looking back toward the path we'd used to get to the clearing. I listened carefully, but didn't hear anything unusual. Birds, wind in the trees, maybe some distant traffic noise from the main road. Hear what? I asked. David crept over to the edge of the clearing and peered through the trees. After a moment, he motioned for me to come over and pointed down the path. "There's someone coming," he said quietly. "And it's not any of the kids from the neighborhood." I looked where he was pointing and saw a man walking slowly down the path toward our clearing. He was probably in his 30s or 40s, wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and he was moving deliberately, like he knew exactly where he was going. He definitely wasn't anyone I recognized from our neighborhood, and there was no reason for a strange adult to be walking through our woods. David's military games suddenly didn't seem like fun and games anymore. We were two small children alone in the woods, with an unknown adult approaching. And we were far enough from the houses that no one would hear us if we called for help. David grabbed my arm and pulled me behind a large fallen tree that formed part of our fort's structure. "We need to hide until he goes away," David whispered. "Don't make any noise." We crouched behind the log and watched through gaps in the branches as the man entered our clearing. He looked around carefully, examining our fort and the supplies we'd been using. He picked up some of the tools we'd brought and seemed to be evaluating the work we'd been doing. Then he called out, not loudly, but in a normal speaking voice that carried clearly through the quiet woods. "I know you're here," he said. "I saw you working when I was walking through earlier. Come on out. I'm not going to hurt you." David and I looked at each other with wide eyes. The man had been watching us without our knowledge, which was terrifying enough. But his casual tone and the fact that he was trying to convince us to reveal ourselves made the situation feel much more dangerous. Every instinct told us to stay hidden. The man continued talking as he moved around the clearing. "I used to build forts like this when I was a kid," he said. "You've done a really good job here. I bet you know all the best hiding spots in these woods. I'd love to see what else you've built." He spent about 10 minutes examining our fort and calling out occasionally, trying to convince us to show ourselves. At one point, he sat down on a tree stump and pulled out a pack of cigarettes, like he was planning to wait us out. David and I remained perfectly still behind our log, barely breathing, watching him through the branches. Finally, the man seemed to give up. He stood up, looked around the clearing one more time, and said, "Well, maybe I'll see you here another day." Then he walked back down the path in the direction he'd come from. David and I waited another 20 minutes before we dared to move. When we were sure the man was gone, we gathered up our tools as quietly as possible and took a different path back toward the neighborhood. We didn't talk until we were almost to David's backyard. "That was really weird," I said, still shaken by the encounter. Why would some random guy be walking around in our woods? David's expression was more serious than I'd ever seen it. He wasn't just walking around, he said. Hay knew we were there before he got to our clearing. He'd been watching us for a while. We decided to tell David's parents what had happened. His father, Mr. Johnson, listened to our story and asked several detailed questions about what the man looked like and what he'd said to us. Mr. Johnson's reaction convinced me that we'd been right to be scared. He immediately called my parents and then called the police. 2 officers came to the Johnson house and interviewed David and me separately. They took our descriptions of the man and asked about exactly where in the woods the incident had occurred. They seemed particularly interested in the fact that he'd been watching us without our knowledge and had tried to convince us to come out of hiding. The officers explained that adults don't usually have legitimate reasons for being alone in wooded areas where children play. They told our parents that the man's behavior, watching children secretly, approaching their play area, trying to convince them to reveal themselves, followed patterns they'd seen in cases involving child predators. They increased patrols in our neighborhood and asked all the parents to keep their children closer to home for a while. They also contacted the police in neighboring towns to see if there had been similar reports of suspicious men approaching children in wooded or isolated areas. David and I weren't allowed to play in the woods anymore, at least not without adult supervision. Our parents set up a system where one of them would check on us every 30 minutes if we were playing outside, and we had to stay where we could be seen from someone's house at all times. About 3 weeks later, we learned why the police had taken our report so seriously. A man matching the description we'd given had approached 2 children at a playground in a town about 15 miles from us. In that incident, he'd tried to convince an 8-year-old girl to come with him to see some puppies he claimed to have in his car. The girl had run home and told her parents, who called police immediately. The investigation revealed that this man had been systematically visiting areas where children played, apparently looking for opportunities to isolate potential victims. Parks, wooded areas, school playgrounds after hours, anywhere children might be found without close adult supervision. They eventually caught him after he tried the same approach with a child whose parent happened to be nearby. His name was Thomas Mitchell, and he had a history of child molestation convictions in other states. He'd been moving from town to town, staying in cheap motels, and spending his days scouting locations where he might find vulnerable children. Mitchell was arrested and charged with attempted kidnapping and child endangerment. During the investigation, police found photographs of various playgrounds and wooded areas in his motel room, along with notes about the times of day when children were most likely to be present without adult supervision. He eventually pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The detective who worked on the case told our parents that David's decision to hide and my willingness to follow his lead had likely prevented us from becoming victims of a very dangerous predator. This experience taught me that predators often spend considerable time observing potential victims before making their move. Mitchell hadn't just randomly walked into our woods and hoped to find children there. He'd been watching our neighborhood, learning our routines, and identifying times and places where children were isolated and vulnerable. I also learned that trusting your instincts about dangerous situations can be life-saving, even when you're just a child. David's immediate reaction to hide when he saw an unknown adult approaching had been exactly the right response, even though we couldn't have articulated why at the time. The incident changed how I thought about personal safety and made me much more aware of my surroundings, even as a child. I became hyper-vigilant about adults who seemed to be paying too much attention to children, or who appeared in places where they didn't have obvious reasons for being. Most importantly, I learned that it's crucial for children to tell trusted adults about encounters with strangers, even when nothing obviously threatening has occurred. If David and I had kept the woods incident to ourselves, Mitchell might have continued stalking children in our neighborhood until he found a victim who wasn't as cautious or quick-thinking as David had been. The experience also highlighted the importance of teaching children specific safety protocols for different situations. David's knowledge about hiding and remaining silent had come from his interest in military history, but those skills translated directly to a real-world dangerous situation. Children who know how to hide, stay quiet, and get to safety when they feel threatened are better equipped to protect themselves from predators. Our woods were eventually developed into additional housing, partly because the incident had made parents in the neighborhood realize that isolated areas near residential developments could attract people looking to harm children. The new houses eliminated the hiding spots and secluded areas that had made our neighborhood attractive to someone like Mitchell. I think about that afternoon in the woods, sometimes wondering what would have happened if David hadn't been with me, or if we'd been less cautious, or if we'd believed Mitchell's reassurances that he wasn't going to hurt us. The fact that he'd been watching us without our knowledge still gives me chills. How long had he been there? What was he planning to do if we'd revealed ourselves? The incident taught me that childhood innocence is fragile and that there are people in the world who specifically target children because of our natural trust and vulnerability. But it also taught me that children are capable of protecting themselves when they're given the right information and encouraged to trust their instincts about dangerous situations.